You can keep my husband, but take off my robe before you leave my house. Claire Adams returned early to the mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, expecting to find only silence, but she opened the door to her own bedroom and saw another woman wearing her silk robe. Marshall, her husband, tried to turn the humiliation into a misunderstanding, while his family prepared for a formal dinner downstairs, acting as if nothing had happened. Claire did not scream, she did not beg, and she did not make a scene. She simply gathered what was hers and walked down the stairs with a suitcase in her hand. That night, everyone would discover that the house where they called her useless had never belonged to the man who claimed to own it all. Claire Adams did not throw the bedroom door open with violence. She just turned the brass knob, pushed the heavy mahogany, and stood in the doorway, as if her own body had understood before her mind that a part of her life had ended right there. Isabella was standing in front of the oval mirror, her wet hair falling over bare shoulders, wearing the ivory silk robe that Claire had bought in Paris after her father's death. Embroidered on the chest were the initials C.A.M., Claire Adams Vance, the name she had almost stopped using just to fit better into that family. The mistress turned around, startled at first, then lifted her chin, pretending that the fabric was hers, that the room was hers, that the silence also belonged to her. Claire looked at the unmade bed, at the wine glass on the nightstand, at the open perfume bottle next to her wedding photograph. Then she spoke with a calm so cold that Isabella blinked twice. You can keep my husband, but take off my robe before you leave my house. Isabella tried to laugh, but the sound came out small. Your house, she murmured. Claire took a step inside. My bedroom, my mirror, my robe. Do you want me to repeat it slower? The bathroom door opened behind them, and Marshall appeared in a poorly buttoned dress shirt, his face hardening the instant he saw his wife. Claire, this is not what you are thinking. She did not look away from Isabella. Then explain why she is wearing my skin. Marshall closed the bathroom door, as if that action could put the world back in order. He was a handsome man, 40 years old, dark hair, always impeccable. He was the classic Wall Street executive who knew how to smile in board meetings, lie at charity galas, and ask for forgiveness with the exact same expression he used to negotiate contracts. But at that moment, there was a flaw in him, an exposed nerve between shame and irritation. You came back early, he said, as if the mistake of the night had been her schedule. Claire finally turned her face to him. I came home. Marshall took a deep breath, approaching with his hand extended. Do not make a scene. My mother is downstairs. My uncles have arrived. The dinner is about to start. Claire looked at that hand as if it were a forged document. You brought a woman to our bed and you are worried about the dinner appetizers. Isabella tightened the belt of the robe, now feeling less secure. Marshall told me you two were practically separated. Claire gave a joyless smile. Practically separated. What a convenient phrase for a woman wearing another woman's robe. Marshall hardened his voice. Enough. I will not allow you to humiliate anyone inside my house. The silence that followed was so dense that even the central air conditioning seemed to quiet down. Claire looked around at the linen-covered walls, at the sculpture her father had chosen when he was still alive, at the painting by a Brooklyn artist bought with the first return from her trust fund. Your house, she repeated softly. Marshall, you should be careful with the words you choose in front of things that are not yours. She did not cry. Perhaps that was what bothered him the most. Marshall knew a Claire who swallowed her grievances, who locked the bathroom door to wash her face in silence, who fixed her lipstick before going downstairs to greet guests and preserve his last name. The woman standing in the bedroom seemed like someone else. Even though she wore the same simple navy blue dress from a late afternoon meeting and carried the same logo-free leather tote bag, Claire walked up to Isabella, and the mistress took a half step back, touching the necklace on her chest. Take it off, Claire said. Isabella looked at Marshall, expecting protection. You are not going to let her talk to me like this, are you? Marshall opened his mouth, but Claire cut him off without raising her voice. Do not ask him for permission to return what was never yours. Isabella untied the knot of the robe with tense fingers, gathering the fabric close to her body for a few seconds, as if she could still win that ridiculous contest. Then she stepped into the walk-in closet and returned wearing a red dress, entirely too tight for a casual visit. She threw the robe on the armchair, but Claire did not move. In my hand. Isabella froze. You are exaggerating. Claire extended her arm. I am not being polite. The fabric fell into her palm, warm, perfumed, with a strange scent. Claire folded the robe slowly, as if folding a flag after an intimate war. Then, she took her wedding band off her finger, stared at the pale mark the gold had left on her skin, and dropped the ring into the pocket of her bag. Downstairs, the noise of the Vance family filled the dining room with rehearsed joy, laughter, silverware clinking against crystal glasses, and the voice of Beatrice, Marshall's mother, giving instructions to the private chef as if she were still commanding an old southern plantation and not a modern estate in Connecticut, with a smart home system and a climate-controlled wine cellar. Claire heard her own breathing as she entered the closet. Marshall's clothes took up more space than hers, not because he had more, but because he had slowly pushed his suits, his shoes, and his watches to the center of everything. Just like with everything else. She pulled out a medium graphite-colored suitcase, packed a few items of clothing, documents from a hidden drawer, and a small box filled with letters from her father. Marshall followed her to the closet door. "You are not going downstairs like this." Claire zipped up the suitcase. "Like what, Marshall? Like I have been kicked out?" She looked up. "I was not kicked out. I am leaving. Because of a trivial mistake." The word hung in the air between them. Obscene. Claire stepped close enough for him to feel the absence of the perfume she used every night out of marital habit. Forgetting a birthday is a trivial mistake. Breaking a glass is a trivial mistake. Putting your mistress inside my bedroom is a choice. Marshall lowered his voice. "You always turn everything into a moral judgment, and you turn every betrayal into an etiquette problem." He grabbed her arm, not with brutal force, but with the arrogance of someone who still believed he had the right to block another person's path. Claire looked at his fingers on her skin. "Let go." He let go, not out of respect, but because for the first time, he did not know what to do next. When Claire reached the top of the stairs, Isabella was right behind her, trying to regain her poise, and Marshall walked with quick steps by her side, whispering that she needed to think, that his mother did not deserve to go through this, that everything could be resolved after dinner. The crystal chandelier illuminated the main foyer as if it were a set for an architectural magazine. Below, his family gradually fell silent. Beatrice was the first to look up, elegant in a white suit, pearls around her neck, and an expression that knew no guilt. Beside her were Marshall's two uncles, a cousin holding a smartphone, his younger brother, and Martha, the housekeeper, standing near the console table with the rigid posture of someone who had seen more than she could say. "Claire?" Beatrice asked, looking at the suitcase and then at the folded robe over her daughter-in-law's arm. "What is this theatricality?" Claire took a step down. Marshall attempted a dry laugh to spin the scene into a feminine whim. "She had a shock, Mother. We will talk later." Beatrice set her glass down. "A shock over what?" Isabella appeared at the top of the stairs, now without the robe, but with a presence entirely too obvious to fake a coincidence. Marshall's cousin widened her eyes. The uncle coughed. Martha lowered her head. Claire continued descending, step by step, unhurried, as if each movement returned to her a piece of the dignity that the house had tried to consume. Halfway down the staircase, Beatrice understood enough to choose the wrong side with perfect speed. "Oh, Claire, please, are you really going to turn a delicate situation into a spectacle in front of the family?" Claire stopped on the final step. "I found a woman wearing my robe in my bedroom." Beatrice did not look at Isabella. She looked at Marshall, then at the suitcase, as if calculating social damages. Marriages have rough patches. Smart women do not destroy a family over pride. Claire felt an old ache, deeper than the physical betrayal. It was the confirmation that, for this family, her role had always been to absorb humiliations with discretion. Marshall stepped closer to his mother, grateful for the defense. "That is exactly it. Claire needs to calm down." Beatrice took a few steps toward the base of the stairs and spoke in a tone that sounded like advice but carried venom underneath. "My dear, you entered this house because my son gave you a place. Do not forget that. Before Marshall, who were you in society?" The silence split open. Claire looked at everyone's faces. No one defended her. No one asked if she was okay. At the top of the stairs, Isabella regained her smile. It was in that exact moment that something inside Claire finally died. Not the love that had been agonizing for months. What died was the need to be accepted by people who had always treated her as a guest. Claire walked over to the console table, where a silver tray held keys, invitations, and business cards. She placed her wedding band there, without dramatic flair, just a small metallic click that crossed the room like a sentence. Marshall grew pale. "Do not do this." She adjusted the folded robe over her suitcase. "I already did." Beatrice narrowed her eyes. "You are forgetting that everything here has my son's name on it." Claire breathed slowly. It was tempting to tell the whole truth right then, to crush that arrogance with deeds, dates, records, and signatures. But her father had taught her that the truth, when delivered too early, looks like revenge. When delivered at the right time, it looks like justice. "Are you sure about that?" she asked. Beatrice let out a short laugh. "Are you bluffing?" Marshall flinched before he could stop his own body, and Claire caught the micro-expression, the fear passing over his face like the shadow of a cloud. Isabella saw it too and frowned. Martha, the housekeeper, raised her eyes to Claire almost imperceptibly, and that tiny gesture brought back a memory of her father, years ago, handing her a copy of the deed and telling her that love did not require blindness. Claire touched the bag where the envelope her lawyer, Robert, had given her that afternoon rested, but she did not take it out. Not yet. I am not bluffing, Beatrice. I am just being more elegant than you people deserve. Marshall stepped forward, no longer trying to look tick. Claire, enough. Go upstairs, put that suitcase away, and let us talk like adults. She tilted her head. Adults do not hide mistresses in master bedrooms. Marshall's brother muttered something. Maybe a protest. Maybe an attempt to break the awkwardness. But Claire kept going. Adults do not let their mother humiliate their betrayed wife just to save a dinner party. Adults do not use the word family when they actually mean convenience. Isabella walked down a few steps, irritated at being reduced to a secondary presence in a war she thought she was starring in. You speak as if you were St. Clair. Maybe Marshall looked elsewhere for what he could not find at home. Claire looked at her with an almost impersonal sadness. He looked elsewhere for a woman willing to wear what belonged to me. That is not love, Isabella. That is an occupation. The word hit the mistress with precision. Marshall clenched his jaw. You do not have the right to speak to her like that. For the first time, Claire laughed, a low, humorless sound, like someone watching a man try to put out a fire after handing over the matches. You put her in my bedroom, in my robe, surrounded by my things, and now you tell me I do not have the right. Marshall, you are abusing fiction today. His cousin lowered her phone, perhaps too scared to keep recording. Beatrice, however, remained motionless, stubborn. If you walk out that door, do not expect to come back making demands. Claire grabbed the handle of her suitcase. I am not coming back to ask for anything. Claire's phone buzzed inside her bag. The screen displayed the name Robert Sinclair, the Addams family lawyer. She declined the call, but a text notification popped up right after. Claire, do not sign any documents. The deed and the administration clause are ready for review tomorrow at 9 a.m. Marshall saw only a fragment of the sentence, and his expression shattered for a second. Claire noticed. Beatrice did not. Isabella tried to read it from afar, but Claire put the phone away. Who was it? Marshall asked, his voice entirely too low. Someone who still remembers what belongs to whom. Beatrice lost her patience. You have always been ungrateful. My son gave you a last name, a position, a life many women would dream of having. Claire ran her fingers over the strap of her bag, feeling the absence of her ring like a painful liberation. Your son gave me empty nights, repetitive excuses, and today he gave me the final image I needed. My life, Beatrice, was given to me by my father. The rest I paid far too high a price for, just to keep pretending it was a gift. Her mother-in-law's face hardened at the mention of Claire's father. Marshall closed his eyes for an instant, knowing that reference was a dangerous door. Isabella, growing impatient, spoke up. If you are leaving, just leave already. Claire looked at her. I am going. But you are not sleeping here tonight either. The sentence dropped like a glass shattering on marble. Isabella let out a nervous laugh. Marshall, tell her no. He did not reply immediately, and that delay was worth more than any confession. Beatrice took a step forward. How dare you give orders in my son's house? Claire turned to Martha, who was standing pale near the console table. Martha, please ask the security detail to call my car, and tell them no one is to enter the master bedroom until further notice. The housekeeper hesitated for only a second before answering firmly. Yes, Mrs. Addams. The use of her maiden name crossed the room with the force of a legal document. Marshall turned to the employee. Martha, you take orders from me. The woman lowered her eyes but did not step back. With all due respect, Mr. Vance, since I started working here, the administration of the house has always come through Mrs. Addams's office. Marshall's uncle dropped his napkin. Beatrice stood frozen. Isabella stared at Marshall as if he had been shot in the chest. Yes, in an unforgivable humiliation. Claire did not savor the scene. There was no pleasure in watching the lie begin to crack. There was only exhaustion. Deep exhaustion. I am not going to argue about property today, she said. Not while I am still deciding whether I walk out of this house merely as a betrayed wife or as an owner tired of being insulted by her own guests, Marshall whispered. Claire, be careful, she replied without looking at him. I was careful for 6 years. Look where it got me. The Blacktown car pulled up to the entrance a few minutes later, and the sound of the electronic gate echoed through the estate like a warning. The city of New York breathed miles away, but out here in Connecticut, the silence was heavy. Claire walked to the main door, carrying the suitcase in one hand and the folded robe in the other, not as a trophy, but as intimate proof that a boundary had been crossed. Marshall followed her, now out of his family's sight for a few paces, and his voice changed. Less offended husband, more terrified man. Do not do anything tomorrow without talking to me first. Claire stopped at the threshold. Tomorrow we have contracts, meetings, the dinner with the Sterlings. Next week, my image requires stability. She turned her face slowly. Your image slept in my bedroom wearing ivory silk. He swallowed hard. You do not understand the extent of the damage. Claire looked out at the illuminated grounds, at the carefully pruned oaks, at the facade her father never lived to see finished. I understand it better than you imagine. That is why I am not breaking anything today. I am just going to let every single thing return to its rightful name. Marshall turned pale. What does that mean? Claire stepped down the first exterior stair. It means that starting tomorrow, you are going to learn the difference between living in a house and owning it. She got into the car without looking back. Through the window, she saw Isabella appear at the door, Beatrice beside her, and Marshall standing alone in the middle of the steps, all illuminated by the mansion-like characters in a luxurious portrait about to lose its frame. Claire clutched the robe on her lap, closed her eyes for a second, and as the car merged onto the highway toward Manhattan, she finally allowed a single tear to fall. Just one. The rest she saved for the battle that would begin at 9 a.m. Claire's old apartment was located in a discreet pre-war building just blocks from Fifth Avenue, far from the offensive splendor of the Greenwich estate, but close enough to hear the city pulse like a machine that never apologizes. When the car stopped at the entrance, the doorman took a few seconds to recognize her. Perhaps because it had been years since she arrived there in the middle of the night with a small suitcase, red eyes, and a folded silk robe on her lap, holding it like a wounded relic. "Miss Adams?" he asked, opening the door with care. She smiled with an exhausted kindness. "Good evening, George. Do you still keep my spare key?" The man nodded without asking questions, and for that, Claire almost cried again. There was a rare dignity in people who did not demand explanations the exact moment someone was falling apart. In the elevator, catching her own reflection in the brushed steel, she touched the finger where her wedding ring had been for 6 years. The indented skin felt more honest than the gold. Stepping into the apartment, she smelled closed wood, old books, and coffee, a scent that no longer existed but her memory insisted on inventing. The place had belonged to her father, Arthur Adams, before the illness took him far too quickly. Claire turned on a lamp, placed her suitcase on the floor, and set the robe on an armchair. Only then did she take a deep breath, like someone walking back into a life she had abandoned without realizing it. She did not sleep. She took off the navy blue dress, put on an oversized white button-down shirt left in her father's closet, and walked barefoot across the living room until she found the box of letters she had brought from the mansion. There were notes from Arthur in his firm handwriting, pieces of advice that used to sound like the exaggerations of a wealthy, paranoid man, but now resonated like a kind of visionary love. "Daughter, assets are not proof against love. They are protection against cowardice," one of them read. Claire read that sentence 3 times, not because she did not understand it, but because she finally grasped the price of having ignored it. At 6:40 a.m., her phone began to vibrate incessantly. Marshall called first, then Beatrice, then an unknown number she assumed belonged to one of his assistants. The text messages came in waves. "We need to talk like adults," Marshall wrote. "You embarrassed the family," Beatrice typed. Isabella sent only a short, perfumed line of hasty triumph. Running away does not change what happened. Claire stared at the screen without replying. At 8:50 a.m., Robert Sinclair, the Adams family lawyer, rang the doorbell. He arrived in a gray suit, carrying a dark leather briefcase, wearing the expression of a man who had waited years for a conversation nobody wanted to have. "Claire," he said, looking around the apartment, noting the oversized men's shirt on her frame and the exhaustion on her face. "Before anything else, are you safe?" She nodded. "Safe, yes. Intact, not yet." Robert did not try to comfort her with empty platitudes. He simply opened his briefcase on the table and replied, "Then let us start with the part that can be rebuilt." As Claire listened to Robert explain every word, it felt like pulling a veil off a carefully polished lie. The Greenwich mansion had been purchased through a family trust created by Arthur before her wedding. The renovations, the interior design, the security, the maintenance, and even the acquisition of several art pieces had been paid for with her private funds, protected under clear clauses. Even though Marshall had received administrative authorization to deal with vendors and represent the couple at social events tied to the property. "He does not own the house, Claire," Robert said, sliding a copy of the deed toward her. "He never did. He had a limited, renewable delegation of administration, valid only as long as there was no abuse of purpose, misuse, or attempt to transfer assets without your consent." Claire traced her finger over the line where her full maiden name appeared. "Claire Adams." It was like reuniting with a woman who had been locked behind expensive doors. And if he used the house to negotiate his image with investors? Robert tightened his lips. It depends on what he promised. But if he tied the property to his personal assets to gain leverage, we have a serious problem. If he tried to make you sign a new power of attorney yesterday or in the last few days, we have another one. Claire remembered the dinner Marshall had insisted on hosting for his mother, claiming the family needed to unite. She remembered the documents he had left in the library 2 nights prior, pretending they were routine paperwork. He wanted me to sign a broad power of attorney, she murmured. He said it was to streamline maintenance contracts. Robert closed his eyes for a moment. I feared as much. Back at the mansion that same morning, Marshall was feigning control in front of an untouched breakfast spread. Beatrice sat at the head of the table, even though that seat had never officially belonged to her, reading texts on her phone with a stiffness that betrayed her fear. Isabella appeared wearing a dark green dress and sandals that clicked too loudly on the marble, as if every step was an attempt to prove she belonged. But there was something different in the air. The wine cellar system was requesting an authorization password for restocking. The head landscaper had called, asking if he was still supposed to take orders from Mrs. Adams's office. And the secondary corporate card Marshall had given Isabella the previous week had been declined at a luxury boutique on Madison Avenue just before 9 a.m. You said she could not do anything, Isabella whispered, gripping her phone as if the device itself had insulted her. Marshall looked up, irritated. I said she would not do anything. Beatrice tapped her spoon against her saucer. Then make your wife come to her senses. A hurt woman is manageable, Marshall. A woman surrounded by lawyers becomes a problem. He ran a hand through his hair, ruining his impeccable styling for a few seconds. Robert Sinclair should not be involved in this. Beatrice narrowed her eyes. Robert Sinclair has always been involved. Your mistake was believing Claire had forgotten her own last name. The comment slipped out, sounding more honest than maternal, and Marshall glared at her. Isabella noticed the crack. What exactly are you all talking about? No one answered immediately. In that silence, she understood with brutal clarity that the fantasy Marshall had sold her had structural flaws. The mansion was not exactly his. The life of luxury might have had a hidden female signature all along, and the title of future lady of the house she had rehearsed in the mirror might be nothing more than a costume. Did you lie to me? She asked. Marshall turned his face away. I oversimplified. Beatrice closed her eyes. Because she knew the men of the Vance family always called a lie an oversimplification when they needed to protect their pride. In the afternoon, Marshall showed up at Claire's apartment unannounced. The doorman buzzed up with obvious discomfort, and Claire almost told him to deny entry. But Robert was still there, and he made a subtle gesture indicating it might be useful to listen. Marshall walked in expecting to find a devastated wife, but instead found a woman sitting at a table covered in organized documents, her hair tied back, wearing a white button-down, emanating a serenity that offended him more than tears ever could. So this is it, he said, before even offering a greeting. You run straight to your lawyer and start freezing accounts. Claire closed a folder slowly. Good morning to you too, Marshall. He glared at Robert. This is a matter between husband and wife. Robert answered politely. When it involves improperly administered assets, it ceases to be strictly a marital issue. Marshall pointed a finger at him. You have always tried to belittle me. Claire stood up. No, Marshall, you just always confuse boundaries with humiliation. He laughed, but his eyes were hard. Do you think you can destroy an entire life just because you caught me in an embarrassing situation? Embarrassing is the word you use for cheating. I made a mistake, he said, using a phrase close to the truth for the first time, but he quickly ruined it. But you also made a mistake when you decided to act like I was a stranger inside my own house. Claire walked over to the window. Down below, Fifth Avenue kept moving, indifferent. Buses rolling by, people crossing streets, coffee cart vendors, executives running late. That is the difference between us, she said. You are still worried about the house. I am worried about what you had to do to believe it was yours. Marshall lowered his tone, trying to trade arrogance for intimacy. Claire, look at me. We built so much together. She turned around slowly. Built? Or did I provide the structure and you called it a conquest? The blow landed. He clenched his jaw. You never forgave me for not being born in Adams. The phrase came out heavy with old resentment, and for the first time, Claire saw not just the betrayer, but the wounded boy he hid beneath expensive suits. Except seeing the wound did not erase the damage. I married you, Marshall. I took your last name. I defended your business decisions when my father had doubts. I went to dinners where your mother treated me like an ornamental centerpiece. I smiled for investors who thought you were brilliant because I stayed quietly behind you. What more did you want? He answered too quickly. I wanted to be respected. Claire felt the sadness weigh on her. Then why did you try to make me smaller? Marshall opened his mouth, but there was no clean answer. Robert remained silent, a witness to a truth that required no legal stamp. Marshall rubbed his face. Isabella means nothing compared to what we have. Claire absorbed the sentence with a profound exhaustion. Do you think that comforts me? You destroyed our bedroom for someone who means nothing? He took a step forward. I can fix this. She shook her head. You cannot, because you do not even understand what you broke. After Marshall left without a hug, without a deal, and without recovering a single authorization, Claire finally opened her father's letter. Arthur's handwriting seemed to fill the entire room. He did not speak against Marshall directly. He spoke about Claire, about how she had a dangerous tendency to love by trying to prove she didn't need protection, about how strong women also confuse sacrifice with greatness, about how a house can become a prison when gratitude is used as a shackle. If you ever read this because someone tried to take what is yours, do not feel ashamed for having trusted them. The shame belongs to the one who confused trust with weakness. Claire closed her eyes, and this time she cried more than a single tear. Robert pretended to examine paperwork to give her privacy. When she composed herself, she folded the letter carefully and put it in her bag next to her wedding ring, which she still did not know if she would return, sell, or bury in some corner of her memory. Tomorrow, she said, her voice hoarse. I want to audit everything Marshall manages in my name. Robert nodded. Everything. Claire looked at the robe on the armchair. The ivory silk, now devoid of Isabella's perfume, merely marked by a night that would never again be innocent. Everything. The house, the accounts, the art collections, the corporate contracts where my name appears only as a footnote, and I want the security footage from the upstairs hallway from yesterday. Robert closed his briefcase with gravity. Then tomorrow we begin separating the truth from the performance. Claire walked to the window. The Manhattan skyline gleamed like a long blade in the late afternoon sun. For the first time in years, the city did not seem to demand that she return anywhere. At the mansion, Marshall arrived at dusk and found Beatrice sitting alone in the grand living room, no music playing, no guests, stripped of the aesthetic safety net she usually threw over family scandals. Isabella had locked herself in a guest room, furious, sending texts to friends and deleting half of them before pressing send. Beatrice held a glass of wine but wasn't drinking. You need to control this before it reaches the board members, she said. Marshall tossed his keys onto the console table, in the exact spot where Claire had left her ring. The sound made him shudder. She has already started. Claire, Robert, her dead father, all of them. Beatrice glared at him harshly. Do not blame the dead for the mistakes of the living. The sentence surprised Marshall. Beatrice held an old anger toward Arthur Adams, but also a respect she had never confessed. Did you know? He asked. Did you know the house was entirely hers like this? Beatrice looked away toward the chandelier. I knew enough to understand you should have never provoked Claire inside, the only place where she held absolute right. Marshall sank onto the sofa. For the first time, the mansion felt too big, too beautiful, too quiet. A house he used to parade as a crown now observed him like a witness. From upstairs, a door slammed. Isabella. Beatrice sighed. What now? Marshall looked at the staircase, at the hallway leading to the locked master bedroom, at the console table where the absence of the ring felt heavier than any physical object. Now, he said, though his voice lacked conviction, I am bringing my wife back. Beatrice did not respond. Because they both knew that after that morning, Claire might not want to return, and even if she did, it might not be to stay. The next morning, Claire woke up before her alarm. Not out of discipline, but because her body still didn't know how to rest outside of a war zone. The pale light filtered through the curtains of the pre-war apartment, casting lines over her father's books and the stack of legal folders Robert had left on the table. For a few minutes, she lay perfectly still, listening to the city wake up. Distant horns, the building's elevator, muffled voices in the hallway, someone ordering coffee at the corner deli. It was an ordinary, almost modest life compared to the Greenwich estate, but there was an honesty here that the big house had lost. Claire got up, washed her face, and saw in the mirror a woman without a wedding ring, with dark circles under her eyes, but strangely looking more like herself. When she picked up her phone, she found dozens of messages, some from Marshall alternating between guilt and polite threats, others from Beatrice, wielding words like family, shame, and balance with the skill of someone who turned emotional blackmail into a tradition. There was also a message from Isabella, sent at 2 a.m. You might have the paperwork, but he chose me. Claire read it without feeling the expected sting. Perhaps because, in that moment, Marshall's choice felt less like a loss and more like a revelation. She typed a single response, not to Isabella, but to Robert. I want the hallway footage, the access logs, and everything Marshall has signed in my name over the last 12 months. Before hitting send, she added, "No spectacle, just the truth." Robert arrived exactly at 9 a.m., bringing coffee in paper cups, a stack of copies, and a graver expression than the day before. "We have a bigger problem," he said before even sitting down. Claire took the coffee without taking a sip. "Bigger than an accidental mistress in my robe?" Robert did not smile. Marshall used the mansion and the trust fund structure as informal proof of liquidity in at least 3 major negotiations. Nothing officially signed in your name, thankfully, but there are pitch decks, invitations, hosted events, photographs, and ambiguous promises. Claire closed her eyes for a second. She mentally replayed all those gala dinners where she smiled by his side, believing she was helping her husband grow his firm, not realizing she was lending her legacy to a stage play. "He sold an image?" "Yes," Robert continued. "The image that the Adams capital was practically under his control." Claire set the coffee down. "And it was, because I let it be." Robert looked at her firmly. "Administering is not owning. Trusting is not transferring. You carry no legal blame for someone exploiting your trust." Claire knew this intellectually, but her heart was less educated. He went on. "I also received confirmation from Martha last week. Marshall asked for the main guest suite to be prepped for a long-term visitor. Yesterday, before you arrived, Isabella entered your bedroom using his passcode. The hallway cameras logged it." Claire breathed slowly. The true blow was in the details. It hadn't been an impulse. It hadn't been a slip-up. There was logistics, preparation, a silent intention to replace a woman inside her own house before officially evicting her from his life. At 11 a.m., Marshall showed up again. But this time he did not ride the elevator alone. He brought a navy blue briefcase, his expensive cologne, and a visible attempt at humility, as if he had rehearsed the exact look of remorse in the elevator, one that wouldn't bruise his ego. Claire received him in the living room with Robert present, despite her husband's irritated glare. "Do you still need an audience to speak to me?" he asked. "After you called a betrayal an embarrassing situation, yes," Claire replied, pointing to an armchair without smiling. Marshall did not sit down. "I came to propose a truce." Robert folded his hands over the table. "A truce or a signature?" Marshall shot him a cutting look, then opened his briefcase and pulled out several documents. Temporary separation of public image, administrative preservation of assets, a non-disclosure agreement, nothing unreasonable. Claire did not touch the papers. "You came to demand my silence." "I came to prevent a marital crisis from destroying companies, jobs, and reputations." "Curious," she said. "When the marital crisis was inside my bedroom, jobs did not seem to be a concern." Marshall took a deep breath. "I made a mistake with Isabella. I admit it. But exposing everything now would be cruel to everyone." Claire tilted her head. "Cruel to whom? To your mother? To your mistress? To the partners who believe you live on a fortune of your own making? Or to you, who will have to explain why your entire life had a footnote bearing my last name?" The phrase hit the most hidden nerve. Marshall closed his folder too quickly. "You always knew how to use that against me." Claire stood up. "No, Marshall. I spent 6 years pretending I didn't see it just so I wouldn't hurt you." He stood in silence, and for the first time that day, something resembling genuine pain crossed his face without immediately being covered by anger. "You do not know what it is like to walk into a boardroom and realize everyone looks at you as the heiress's husband," he said, his voice dropping. "You do not know what it is like to work 12-hour days and still hear that the house, the social circle, the country club invites, all of it came from your father." Claire felt a pang of compassion, but she did not allow it to turn into absolution. "And your answer was to turn me into the silent woman behind your chair." Marshall pressed his lips together. "I wanted to be seen, so you erased me to stand out." He opened his hands as if logic had betrayed him. "I felt small in that house." Claire looked at him for a long time. "The house was large, Marshall. You just decided I needed to shrink so you could fit inside it." Robert looked away, offering moral privacy without leaving the room. Marshall finally sat down, defeated by a truth he could not argue against. "Isabella made me feel admired." Claire nodded slowly, her voice almost sweet. It was so steeped in sorrow. "Of course. She admired the character. I knew the man. It was much harder to impress me." He looked up at her. "Do you still love me?" The question came too late, entirely misplaced and selfish in its urgency. Claire felt her heart stumble, because the answer was not simple. "I still remember the man I loved. But every memory I have of you now has to walk through that bedroom door." At the mansion, Isabella decided that waiting was for people who didn't have a plan. While Marshall was at Claire's apartment, she walked downstairs to the living room wearing dark sunglasses indoors and found Beatrice reviewing invitations for a charity gala that might never happen. "Your daughter-in-law is trying to kick me out," she said bluntly. Beatrice did not look up. My daughter-in-law is trying to regain control. Do not confuse one thing with another. Isabella took her sunglasses off, offended. Are you going to defend her now? Beatrice finally looked at her. I defend the Vance family. You, my dear, are a recent variable. The sentence stung worse than a direct insult. Isabella realized that if Claire had paperwork and Marshall had fear, she only had physical presence. And presence in elite circles was the first thing to be denied when it became inconvenient. So that is it. I am good enough to humiliate Claire, but I am not good enough to take her place. Beatrice set the invitations down. You are useful as long as you do not make the situation worse. Isabella's face shifted. The girl who had worn the silk robe with sheer arrogance gave way to someone far more dangerous, someone used to being discarded before being chosen. I will not go back to being a secret. Beatrice narrowed her eyes. Careful. Women who confuse public exposure with victory usually end up in the wrong headlines. Isabella smiled. Maybe a headline is exactly what this house needs. Minutes later, locked in the guest bedroom, she drafted a message to a high society gossip blog, insinuating that Claire Adams had abandoned her home in a fit of pathological jealousy and was trying to financially ruin her own husband during an emotional breakdown. The news did not explode as a national scandal, but it spread fast enough through the circles that mattered. A luxury blind item account posted, Upper East Side heiress leaves mansion after jealous meltdown, sources say. Real estate and rising exec husband caught in asset dispute over a younger woman. There were no full names, but there were far too many clues. Greenwich. Rising executive. Trust fund warfare. Claire saw the post in the early afternoon, forwarded by an acquaintance pretending to be concerned while fishing for details. For an instant, the humiliation she had avoided the night before was splashed across screens with captions and comments from strangers. She is going to try to paint you as unstable, Robert said, reading over her shoulder. Claire kept her grip on her phone, but her fingers were trembling. Not with fear, with contained rage. It was Isabella. Marshall probably knew. Robert didn't reply, because sometimes honesty meant admitting a lack of proof. Claire stood up and walked to the window. Down below, delivery guys navigated traffic, tourists snapped photos. Ordinary people kept living, unaware that somewhere above them, a woman was deciding whether to react as a wounded victim or a strategist. Her phone rang. Marshall. She answered on speaker. Did you see it? He asked, frantic. Claire replied, I did. I did not authorize this, but you created the environment for it to exist. Claire, please, do not respond publicly. She let out a short laugh. You do not want me to defend myself because my defense includes the truth. Silence on the other end. Then Marshall said, give me time. Claire looked at Robert. You had 6 years. That night, Martha called from a personal number. Claire answered in the apartment hallway, stepping away from Robert, as if the conversation required an old intimacy. The housekeeper spoke softly, terrified of being overheard. Mrs. Adams, forgive me for not saying this earlier. I saw things, I heard things too. Claire rested her forehead against the cold wall. What things, Martha? The woman took a deep breath. Mr. Vance spoke with Mrs. Beatrice in the library about 10 days ago. They were talking about a power of attorney. He said you would sign it if you thought it was to protect his firm. Mrs. Beatrice said that once it was signed, it would be easier to organize the transition of the house without a scandal. I didn't understand everything, but it stuck in my head. Claire closed her eyes. Transition of the house. The phrase was far too clean to mean anything decent. Martha, are you sure? I am. And yesterday, before you arrived, I heard Miss Isabella say in the hallway, when Claire realizes she lost the bedroom, it will be too late to complain about the house. Claire's stomach dropped. It wasn't just infidelity. It was a planned hostile takeover. Are there cameras in the library? Not inside, ma'am. But in the hallway, yes. And maybe the system captures audio near the entrance. I am not sure. Claire exhaled. I will not let you risk your job for me. Martha answered with a firmness that brought tears to Claire's eyes. Your father was the only boss who treated me like a human being when my daughter got sick. You have never humiliated me. I will not stand by silently while they steal your house. The word house in her mouth finally meant shelter again, not prison. Marshall returned to the estate after 8 p.m. and found Isabella in the indoor conservatory, smoking secretly near the illuminated palms. He rarely saw her without the performance, without the seductive posture, without the calculated sweetness. She looked younger and harder, a woman who had learned early on how to turn rejection into an attack. Was it you? He asked. Isabella didn't pretend to misunderstand. Are you asking if I told a gossip page your wife had a meltdown? Marshall stepped closer. You had no right to do that. She laughed, blowing smoke to the side. Right? Funny hearing that word in this house. You are making everything worse. I am existing, Marshall. Something you promised me I would finally get to do. He ran a hand down his face. Not like this. Isabella glared at him, her eyes shining with fury. You took me into her bedroom. You said Claire was just window dressing by now. You said this house was yours, that your mother would accept me once everything was settled. I believed you. Marshall looked away. It was more complicated. No, it was a lie. The silence between them possessed the sharp clarity of cracking glass. Isabella took a step toward him. Do you know what it is like to spend years being the woman who enters through the parking garage, who sits at restaurants far away from the windows, who gets gifts without a signed card? I didn't wear that robe just to provoke Claire. I wore it because you made me believe I finally didn't have to hide anymore. For the first time, Marshall realized his mistress also felt betrayed by his cowardice. Acknowledging this did not make her innocent, merely more human and more dangerous. Delete the post, he said. I didn't publish it, Isabella. She crushed the cigarette in a stone planter. Make Claire shut her mouth, and I will stay quiet. Or else everyone is going to find out your perfect wife also knew how to fake it extremely well. The next day, the crisis reached Wall Street before Marshall did. One of his senior partners, Edward Sterling, requested a private meeting and placed on the table not an accusation, but a doubt which in the corporate world was infinitely worse. Marshall. This story involving Claire might impact the merger negotiations. Marshall adjusted his cuffs. It is a private matter. Edward observed him with the predatory politeness of men used to sniffing out instability. Private until it affects investor confidence. Some of our reputational guarantees rely on the perception of consolidated assets. Marshall felt the urge to break something, but he smiled. My position remains solid. Edward slid a copy of an old pitch deck across the table. In it was a photograph of the Greenwich estate during a hosted event, captioned, Vance Residence, a symbol of family continuity. Marshall recognized the file. He had authorized it himself. Claire had stood beside him in that room wearing a champagne-colored dress, completely silent while he spoke about legacy. Is the residence, Edward asked, truly part of the Vance portfolio? The question was simple and devastating. Marshall looked at the photo and felt Claire's presence in every wall, every painting, every garden light. It is a family structure, Marshall answered. Edward didn't smile. Family structures tend to collapse when the family starts arguing over the deed. At that moment, Marshall's phone buzzed with a text from Beatrice. Isabella is threatening to talk to the press again. Fix this. Right after, a text from Claire. I received reports about the power of attorney. From now on, all communication will be in writing. Marshall closed his eyes. Everything he had tried to keep in separate rooms was now colliding in the exact same hallway. While Marshall lost control in glass boardrooms, Claire carefully chose what she would not do. She would not post a public rant, she would not call Isabella a homewrecker, and she would not expose her intimacy as if her pain were a commodity. Sitting with Robert, she drafted a formal cease and desist, demanding the preservation of all security footage from the mansion, a halt to any alterations to the primary suites, and the immediate cessation of the property's image in commercial materials or negotiations without express written consent. Is this enough for today? Robert asked. Claire read the last line and thought of the gossip post, Beatrice's laugh, Marshall's hand on her arm, and her robe against another woman's skin. For today? Yes. And regarding Isabella? Claire set her pen down. She wants me to fight on her turf. Scandals, insinuations, petty comments. I refuse. Robert nodded in approval. Then what is your turf? Claire looked at her father's letter on the table. The turf of documented truth. At that moment, the intercom buzzed. Martha was downstairs with a plain shopping bag and a nervous face. Claire went down to the lobby to receive her personally. The housekeeper handed over a small flash drive wrapped in a handkerchief. The footage from the hallway from yesterday, and from a few days prior. I asked the tech guy for a copy. I told him it was for maintenance records. Claire held the drive like someone receiving a master key. Martha, could this get you in trouble? The woman answered. A bigger trouble is letting a lie live in someone else's house. Claire hugged her a brief, contained, but profoundly real embrace. For the first time since opening her bedroom door, she did not feel alone. That night, Claire watched the footage on her father's laptop. There was no audio, but there was enough truth in the silence. Isabella entering the bedroom with Marshall right behind her. Isabella stepping out minutes later wearing the robe. Beatrice walking down the hall before dinner, seeing the door ajar, stopping for a second, and continuing on as if nothing had happened. Days earlier, Marshall walking into the library carrying a blue folder, Beatrice right behind him, both looking tense. Later, Isabella in the hallway, touching the handle of the master suite with unwarranted familiarity. Claire did not scream. She did not slam the laptop shut. She just sat very still. Robert, sitting nearby, said, "This changes everything." Claire kept staring at the paused screen, freezing the exact moment Beatrice saw the bedroom door open and chose to walk away. "It does," she replied. "But not because it proves they lied. I already knew that." "Then why?" Claire touched her mother-in-law's frozen face on the screen. "Because it proves my humiliation was not an accident. It was authorized by everyone's omission." The sentence came out without a tremor, and perhaps because of that, it hurt more. Her phone buzzed again. "Marshall, can we have dinner tomorrow at the house? My mother wants to talk. No lawyers, just family." Claire looked at Robert. He waited. She typed calmly, "I will be there tomorrow at 8 p.m., but not without documents." Marshall replied instantly, "Do not turn this into a war." Claire looked at the flash drive, at her father's letter, at the wedding ring resting inside a small box on the table. "You turned my house into an occupied territory," she murmured without sending it. Instead, she simply wrote, "The war started when you all assumed I wouldn't fight back." At the mansion, Marshall read her reply while standing in the upstairs hallway in front of the locked master bedroom door. He didn't have the courage to try his passcode again just to watch it be denied. Behind him, Isabella stood with her arms crossed, while Beatrice slowly ascended the stairs. Three people united not by love but by fear of what Claire would bring the next day. "Is she coming?" Beatrice asked. Marshall nodded. "With legal documents?" Isabella let out a bitter laugh. "Of course. The saintly wife arrives with paperwork." Beatrice shot her a freezing glare. "The legitimate wife arrives with property titles, my dear. They are very different things." Isabella flushed with anger but stayed quiet. Marshall touched the wood of the bedroom door, remembering Claire buying the high thread count sheets, selecting the ambient lighting, placing discreet flowers on the nightstand. At the time, he had mocked her obsession with details. Now, he understood that every detail was a root, and he, who had spent years posing as the owner of the tree, had likely chopped down his own trunk. "Tomorrow," Beatrice said, "you apologize. You promised to send Isabella away for a while. You convince Claire not to tear apart the administrative structure, and then we rebuild the narrative." Isabella turned to her. "Send me away for a while?" Marshall did not answer. He kept staring at the door. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about how to bring Claire back to save his public image. He was thinking about the exact moment she had stopped waiting for him to choose her. And that thought, more than any legal document, left him entirely unmoored. Across the city, Claire turned off the lights in the old apartment, the flash drive safely tucked in her bag. Tomorrow, she would return to the mansion, not as a wife demanding explanations, but as a woman who had finally learned to open doors without asking for permission. Claire arrived at the estate at exactly 8 p.m. No evening gown, no flashy jewelry, zero attempt to look like the wounded wife everyone expected to pacify with flowers and soft tones. She wore an ivory-tailored suit, her hair tied in a low chignon, holding a structured tote bag, carrying a calm that seemed stitched into her bones after nights without sleep. The car pulled up to the main entrance, and the same electronic gate that had opened for her countless times now sounded as if it recognized an owner returning to inspect an invaded property. The security guard straightened his posture when he saw her. "Good evening, Mrs. Adams." She responded with a slight nod, and that simple acknowledgement carried more weight than any grand announcement. At the front door, Marshall was waiting in a dark suit, wearing the face of a man who had aged 3 years in 3 days. Beatrice stood behind him, flawless in a burgundy dress, holding a wine glass she wasn't drinking from. Isabella appeared at the top of the stairs wearing all black, likely choosing between mourning and defiance. Martha remained near the console table, eyes lowered, hands clasped. Claire walked in without asking for permission. Marshall stepped forward, attempting to touch her elbow, but she stepped back just enough to turn his gesture into sheer awkwardness. "Claire, thank you for coming." She looked around at the marble floors, the white floral arrangements, the paintings, the staircase, the exact silver tray where she had left her ring. "I didn't come. I returned." The sentence shifted the gravity in the room. Beatrice lifted her chin. "I hope you returned willing to have a conversation as a family." Claire set her bag on the console. Family does not occupy the bedroom of a betrayed woman and call it a rough patch. They had set the formal dining room as if a catered meal could domesticate the truth. There was fine china, expensive wine, discreet centerpieces, and a golden lighting scheme designed to make everything look less cruel than it actually was. Marshall gestured to the chair beside his, a rehearsed, ancient motion, as if he could still place Claire back in her decorative role. She chose a different chair, directly across from everyone, far enough away not to be mistaken for a reconciled wife. Beatrice noticed and pressed her lips together. Isabella walked down slowly, making no effort to hide her challenging glare, and sat close to Marshall, committing the intentional, petty vulgarity of claiming her territory. Claire didn't even look at her. She looked first at Marshall. "You asked for this dinner? Then begin." He took a deep breath. "I asked for this because things have spiraled out of control. What happened was a mistake. I admit that. But we are facing a situation that could destroy much more than a marriage. There are employees, businesses, commitments, the family's good name." Claire rested her hands on the table. "You put your mistress in my bedroom, and now you want me to think about corporate commitments." Beatrice interjected, smooth and poisonous. "No one is invalidating your pain, my dear. But pain does not give anyone the right to act as if they can wipe out years of construction." Claire offered a faint smile. "Construction is a fascinating word in this house." Isabella let out a short laugh. "Here comes the lecture about the deed." Claire finally turned to face her. "No. A lecture assumes that someone actually wants to learn." Isabella's face hardened. Marshall closed his eyes for a second, already feeling the dinner slip entirely off script. Claire opened her bag, pulled out a thin folder, and left it closed in front of her. "I came to hear exactly how far you people can lie when you know there are legal documents sitting right on the table." Marshall leaned in, his voice low. "Do not do this," Claire replied in the exact same tone. "That is exactly what I told myself for 6 years." Beatrice set her wine glass down with contained force. "You are being unreasonable. Marshall may have failed as a husband, but you cannot use money to humiliate him." Claire stared at her with a heatless sorrow. Interesting to hear that from someone who used my patience as furniture. Beatrice went pale with rage. "I welcomed you into this family. No. You tolerated me while my silence financed the scenery." Marshall's uncle, who had accepted the invitation, likely expecting a quiet reconciliation, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His cousin stared at her plate, lacking the courage to hold Claire's gaze. Isabella crossed her arms. "If you hold so much power, why did you stay? Why didn't you leave sooner?" Maybe because she liked playing the perfect wife. The question was cruel because it poked at a painful truth. Claire did not look away. "I stayed because I confused endurance with love. I stayed because I thought protecting a marriage was nobler than protecting my own dignity. I stayed because women are taught to feel ashamed of other people's failures when they happen inside our own homes." The room went dead silent. Marshall looked at her as if, for the very first time, he was listening to her without immediately calculating his defense. But Claire was not there to finally be understood. "Except yesterday," she continued. "When I found you wearing my robe, Isabella, I realized I wasn't preserving a marriage. I was preserving a highly comfortable lie for everyone but me." It was then that Robert Sinclair walked in. Not dramatically, not like a savior, but as a punctual man who had waited outside until he received Claire's text. The security guard opened the door, and the lawyer appeared holding a thicker briefcase, greeting everyone with just enough politeness to sting. Beatrice stood up. "This is absurd. Claire, you brought a lawyer to a family dinner?" Claire did not move. "You brought a mistress to a family home. We are all expanding our definitions today." Marshall rubbed his face. "Robert, I requested that this remain private." The lawyer replied, "Mrs. Adams also requested that her bedroom remain private." Isabella scoffed but couldn't find a quick comeback. Robert placed the folder next to Claire and remained standing. "I will be brief. Per the request of the asset holder, we are issuing immediate revocation of all administrative authorizations granted to Mr. Marshall Vance pertaining to the Greenwich residence, the maintenance accounts tied to the Adams Family Trust, and the usage of the property's image in commercial materials." Marshall's uncle let out an almost inaudible, "My God." Beatrice went completely rigid. Marshall stood up slowly. "You cannot do this without discussing it with me." Claire looked up at him. "I discussed things with you for years. You called it drama," Robert continued. "The residence has never been part of Mr. Vance's personal portfolio. He was listed strictly as an operational administrator, with no right of alienation, collateralization, guarantee, or transfer. Any document suggesting otherwise, should one exist, will be legally classified as an irregular attempt to expand executive powers." The word attempt hovered over Marshall like a guillotine. Isabella grew incredibly still. The woman who, the day before, had spoken of choices, love, and victory, now stared at Marshall as if he had vanished inside his own suit. "You told me the house was yours," she murmured. Marshall did not answer, and the absence of a reply humiliated him more than any confession. Beatrice tried to seize command again. This house was maintained by the Vance family socially. The events, the connections, the prestige. Robert interrupted without being rude. "Prestige does not generate property titles, Mrs. Vance." Claire almost smiled, but the pain was still larger than the satisfaction. There is also the matter of the master bedroom, Robert stated, opening a second folder. The access logs and security footage have been preserved. They show the unauthorized entry of Miss Isabella into Mrs. Adams's private quarters, utilizing Mr. Vance's access credentials prior to the owner's arrival. Isabella stood up. Are you calling me a trespasser? Claire answered before the lawyer could. I am saying you walked into a place where you had no right to be, and you wore something you had no right to touch. Marshall turned to Claire, now genuinely terrified. Are you going to use security cameras against me? Claire held his gaze. No, Marshall. You used my house against me. The cameras just kept the record. Beatrice looked at Isabella, and for the first time, there was no calculated affection in that look, only a cold risk assessment. Isabella realized she was shifting from being a weapon to becoming a liability. The transformation hurt like a second betrayal. You all knew, Claire said, her voice dropping lower. My mother-in-law saw the door ajar. You, Marshall, handed over the passcode. And you, Isabella, thought that occupying a bedroom would be faster than building a life. None of you acted on impulse. You were just arrogant. Marshall's phone began to ring. He ignored it. It rang again. Then Beatrice's phone buzzed. Then the uncle's. In a matter of seconds, the dining room was overtaken by tiny, terrible sounds, as if the outside world had decided to barge in uninvited. Marshall answered on instinct, stepping 2 paces away. Edward. Not now. The partner's voice was loud enough for Claire to catch fragments. Negotiations suspended, clarifications needed, reputational risk, misrepresentation of assets. Marshall closed his eyes. I will handle it. On the other end, Edward said something that drained all the color from Marshall's face. When he hung up, he looked as if he had lost not just a contract, but the very armor his posture relied on. Beatrice stepped closer to him. What is it? He looked at Claire. The Sterlings suspended the merger meeting. Isabella laughed, a sound of nervous disbelief. Because of a house? Claire stood up slowly. Not because of a house. Because of a man who sold stability while building his entire empire on a revocable permission slip. Robert added, without raising his voice. And because of promotional materials where the residence was presented as the flagship asset of the Vance family, even though it never was. Beatrice pressed a hand to her chest. This can be fixed. Claire stared at her. You have always believed that, haven't you? That any lie can be fixed as long as it's spoken wearing nice clothes, at a well-set table by the right last name? The aging matriarch finally lost a fraction of her elegance. You are destroying my son. Claire shook her head. I am just kicking away the pedestal that never belonged under his feet to begin with. Marshall walked toward Claire but stopped before invading her personal space. It was a small, almost invisible gesture, but entirely different from all the times he had touched her to shut her up. Claire, I know I do not have the right to ask, but please do not do this publicly. I will take the blame. I will send Isabella away. I will redo the paperwork. Just don't burn it all down today. Isabella whipped her head toward him as if she had been slapped. Send Isabella away? Marshall squeezed his eyes shut. But Claire wasn't distracted by their secondary war. Do you still think she is the problem? He opened his mouth, confused. She is not? Claire took a deep breath. Isabella was your choice. But the problem predates her. The problem is the way you stepped into my love looking for a stage. It is the way you turned my trust into scaffolding for your ego. It is the fact that you needed to make me smaller so you could feel like a man. Marshall absorbed every sentence without an immediate defense, perhaps because all those truths already lived inside him. Beatrice tried to intervene, but he raised a hand, demanding silence. For the first time, not to silence Claire, but to actually hear her. I was ashamed, he said, so quietly that almost no one heard. But Claire heard. Ashamed of what? Marshall looked at the mahogany table, at the house, at the woman he had betrayed. Ashamed of needing you, of knowing that without what came from your father, I would have had to prove myself so much more. Of realizing that you never held it over my head, and yet, I constantly held it over my own. Claire felt a tide of sadness rising. So you punished me for a debt I never asked you to pay. The confession didn't save Marshall. It only made him more real. And perhaps that was why it hurt in a much more complex way. Isabella couldn't take it anymore. How beautiful. Now he becomes the victim of his own insecurity, and I become the convenient mistake. Claire looked at her with a newfound attention. You are not convenient, Isabella. You are responsible for exactly what you chose to do. The mistress shook with anger. You only talk like this because you were born with everything. Claire stepped toward the table, picked up the silk robe she had brought neatly folded inside a garment bag, and draped it over an empty chair. Everyone stared at the ivory fabric as if it were a person. I was born to a father who worked hard, yes. I was born with privilege, yes. But absolutely none of that gives you the right to wear my intimacy to cure your hunger for a place in the world. Isabella fell silent, struck not by the accusation, but by the word hunger. There was a truth in it she despised. Beatrice, impatient, tried to seize the reins again. Enough of this moral posturing. What do you want, Claire? Money? An apology? Do you want Marshall on his knees? Claire looked at her mother-in-law for a long moment. I want order. The answer confused everyone. Order? Yes. I want my assets returned to their proper names. I want my bedroom vacated. I want 0 images of this house used in Marshall's business deals. I want the trust accounts fully audited. And I want any member of the Vance family temporarily residing here to sign an acknowledgement of permitted use, not ownership. Marshall's uncle nearly choked. Beatrice lost her color. Isabella took a step back. Claire continued, and I want Isabella out of this house today. Isabella lifted her chin, her eyes wet with hatred. You cannot kick me out like I am some maid. Martha, standing at the back of the room, lowered her gaze. Claire noticed and answered with unwavering firmness. Do not use the word maid as an insult in this house. Unlike you, Martha has always known how to respect closed doors. The housekeeper raised a hand to her mouth, deeply moved, but stayed quiet. Marshall looked at Isabella, then at Claire. It was the choice he had delayed for months, maybe years. But now the choice carried no prize. If he defended Isabella, he validated the invasion. If he sent her away, he lost the mirror that fed his ego. Isabella, he said, his voice cracking, it is best if you go to a hotel tonight. She stared at him as if finally seeing the naked man behind the suit. A hotel? After everything you promised? Beatrice closed her eyes, annoyed by the scene, but did not intervene. Isabella laughed, and this time the laugh was wet with tears. You told me she didn't have the guts. You told me Claire needed the Vance last name more than you needed the Adams money. Marshall turned ghost white. Claire didn't flinch. The sentence didn't surprise her, but hearing it out loud inside that room closed a final loop of humiliation. Marshall tried to speak. Claire. She raised a hand. No, just that. One syllable. For the first time, he obeyed. Isabella grabbed her purse from the sofa and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she stopped in front of the draped robe. For a second, everyone thought she might do something theatrical. Instead, she just whispered, I just wanted to be chosen in front of someone else. Claire answered with cold honesty. Then you should have chosen someone who didn't need to erase another woman just to see you. Isabella walked out without looking back. When the heavy front door clicked shut, the mansion felt larger, emptier, and guiltier. Beatrice sat down slowly, as if her legs were finally giving in to the age her pride usually masked. You got what you wanted, she said to Claire. You humiliated all of us. Claire picked the robe up from the chair. No, Beatrice. I just stopped carrying the humiliation you all created by myself. Robert placed the final documents of the night on the table. Not for Claire's immediate signature, but as formal legal notice for the Vances. Marshall scanned the pages, reading what amounted to his symbolic eviction from an imaginary kingdom. Do I have to leave? He asked, unsure if he was speaking as a husband or a tenant. Claire replied after a long silence. Not yet. I am not going to turn tonight into an emotional eviction. But you no longer sleep in the master suite. And starting tomorrow, anything you use, negotiate, or promise in the name of this house must go through me or Robert. Beatrice clenched her fists. This is a prison. Claire looked at her. No. A prison was living here pretending I owed gratitude for walls my father bought and I maintained. Marshall leaned back in his chair, defeated. Do you hate me? The question didn't come out arrogant. It sounded small, almost childish. Claire felt a cruel impulse to say yes, but the truth was far more exhausted. Today, I don't even have the energy for that. He lowered his eyes. Perhaps it was the first answer that gave him neither punishment nor hope, merely consequences. Before leaving, Claire walked upstairs alone to the master bedroom. Marshall started to follow her, but Robert stopped him with a discreet gesture. The door opened with her old passcode, her code, and the room was overly tidy, as if someone had tried to erase the crime scene with fresh sheets and new flowers. Claire walked over to the window, looking out over the illuminated gardens. Inside that room, every object held a contaminated memory, and yet it was still hers. She touched the mirror where she had seen Isabella, the nightstand where the wine glass had been, the closet where her clothes had been pushed to the margins. She did not cry. She took a few essential items, pulled a photograph of her father from a drawer, and finally left her wedding ring on the center of the bed. She didn't leave it as a dramatic return to Marshall, but as a release of herself. Coming back down, she found everyone in the exact same spots, anchored to the end of an era. Marshall saw her bare hand and understood. Claire, please. She walked past him toward the door. Robert will send the audit schedule tomorrow. Beatrice stood up. And the marriage? Claire stopped without turning completely around. The marriage ended in that bedroom. Today, I just came to correct the emotional deed to the house. Marshall closed his eyes, struck by a sentence no lawyer could have drafted better. Outside, the New York metropolitan air was cool and thick with headlights. Claire got into the car with her folders on her lap. Unlike the first night, she did not clutch the robe like a bleeding wound. She held it like proof that even the most intimate things can be reclaimed when a woman decides to stop apologizing for owning her own life. The next morning, the news didn't hit the papers as a scandalous tabloid spread, but as a dry note in a corporate business column. Vance Group revises utilization of residential assets in corporate decks following portfolio restructuring. Claire read the sentence on her phone while drinking coffee in her father's apartment. She realized the world always found a sterile way to name intimate pain. Portfolio restructuring. Not a single word about a silk robe, an unmade bed, or a wife standing in the doorway of her own bedroom. Not a single word about the exact second she realized physical betrayal was just the surface level of a much older, hostile takeover. Robert had drafted the press release carefully to protect her privacy and prevent Isabella or Beatrice from spinning the narrative. Still, Claire felt a strange pang, almost a nostalgic pity for the woman who would have cried seeing her marriage reduced to legal jargon. Now, she understood that certain formalities act as walls. They don't heal you, but they stop further invasions. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marshall. "Can I drop by? I need to give you something." Claire stared at the screen for a long time. There was no urgency left. That was the real novelty. Before, every text from him dictated her mood, as if he still held the keys to all her internal rooms. Now, it was just a text. She replied, "In the lobby at 11, do not come up." Then she placed the phone face down and opened her father's letter one more time, as if she needed to hear an old voice reminding her that freedom also aches in the first few days. Marshall arrived punctually, carrying a small box and a folder. He wasn't wearing the flawless suit of a corporate titan in control, but a light button-down with rolled-up sleeves and the face of someone who had spent the entire night trying to talk to himself without finding enough excuses. Claire took the elevator down to the lobby, where George the doorman pretended to organize mail so he wouldn't witness too much. Their meeting held the bizarre awkwardness of two strangers who knew each other's cologne by heart. Marshall offered the box first. "Just a few of your things that were left in the library. Letters, a photo of your dad, and a book I thought you'd want." Claire took it without brushing his fingers. "Thank you." He held the folder against his chest, hesitating. "I also signed the usage acknowledgement Robert requested, and I authorized full access for the audit of everything I managed." The sentence could have sounded like a grand, noble gesture, but Claire heard the part that mattered. He was finally not calling compliance with boundaries a humiliation. That is the bare minimum. Marshall nodded. "I know." The silence between them wasn't comfortable, but it was honest. He took a deep breath. Isabella left New York for a few days. "I'm not telling you this to score points. I just want you to know she will not show up at the house again." Claire looked out at the street, where cars rushed by, entirely indifferent to the end of a marriage. "The house will not be used as a stage for either of you anymore." Marshall lowered his eyes. "Are you going to sell it?" Claire took a moment to answer, because the question still touched a raw nerve. "I don't know yet. Maybe I'll turn part of it into the headquarters for my father's foundation. Maybe I'll sell it. Maybe it will sit empty until I can look at those walls without hearing lies." He swallowed hard. "I am truly sorry." Claire tightened her grip on the box. "I believe that now you are. I just don't know what to do with that." The financial audit began that week without sirens, without paparazzi, without the vulgar thrill of a public downfall. It was precisely this discretion that terrified the Vance family the most. Beatrice, accustomed to controlling the narrative through her tone of voice and seating arrangements, discovered that spreadsheets cannot be intimidated by a last name. Every expense tied to the Adams Trust had to be justified. Every social event hosted at the mansion had to be categorized. Marshall's personal interest, corporate benefit, or improper use of family assets. Martha escorted the auditors with silent dignity, opening doors, pointing out cabinets, handing over vendor logs. When Beatrice tried to order a box of old gala invitations removed before the inspection, Martha answered calmly, "Mrs. Adams requested that nothing be moved without being logged." Beatrice glared at the housekeeper for several seconds, perhaps expecting the old automatic obedience. It didn't come. The aging matriarch finally realized that losing power wasn't a grand, dramatic curtain drop. It was calling out an order and discovering your voice no longer commanded another person's body. Marshall watched it all happen, layered in shame. Shame for having cheated? Yes. but also shame in seeing the sheer scale of his lie materialized in receipts, photographs, pitch decks, and dinners where he had spoken of legacy while standing in front of paintings bought by Arthur Adams. One afternoon, sitting alone in the library, he found an old note Claire had written inside an architecture book. Dad used to say a house needs to hold memory, not vanity. Marshall closed the book slowly. The phrase felt like it had been written to condemn him years later. But the truth was worse. Claire had tried to build a memory, and he had turned it into a showroom window. Isabella only resurfaced via text messages, first to Marshall, then to Claire. To him, she wrote long paragraphs accusing him of cowardice, claiming she had been used as a tool to wound a wife he was too afraid to face. To Claire, she sent one short text. "You won because you were born with everything." Claire almost deleted it without answering, but something in the line stopped her. There was venom in it, but also a distorted pain she recognized, even if she refused to accept it. She typed slowly, "I was born with privilege, yes. And you had every right to want a better life. You just didn't have the right to try and take mine through my bedroom door." Isabella's reply took a while. When it arrived, it lacked irony. "He promised I wouldn't be a secret anymore." Claire read it several times and felt an unexpected wave of sadness. Not enough pity to grant absolution, but enough clarity to understand that Marshall had damaged two women in two different ways, offering one silence, and the other a broken promise. "Being seen does not require erasing another woman," Claire replied. Then she blocked the number. Not out of cruelty, but out of emotional hygiene. Some conversations only continue to keep wounds open. That night, Claire folded the ivory robe one last time and placed it inside a box lined with tissue paper. She didn't want to wear it. She didn't want to burn it. She didn't want to turn it into an eternal symbol. She just packed it away. There are objects that don't need to be destroyed to lose their power over you. 2 weeks later, Claire called for a formal meeting at the Greenwich mansion. It was not a dinner. There were no excessive floral arrangements, no wine glasses ready, no ambient music to soften the blows. The main dining table held documents, water, coffee, and chairs arranged without any sentimental hierarchy. Robert sat beside Claire. Marshall arrived alone. Beatrice arrived with calculated tardiness, but found everyone already seated and realized her entrance no longer reorganized the room. Claire started without detours. The preliminary audit confirms the improper use of the property's image in capital-raising materials, and personal expenses commingled with the administration of the house. "I am not going to turn this into a spectacle, but I am not going to pretend it's a minor detail." Marshall, who previously would have protested, simply nodded. "I take full responsibility." Beatrice turned to him, indignant. "Marshall." He didn't look away. "I take responsibility, Mother." Claire observed that tiny fracture between mother and son. It wasn't complete redemption, but it was a beginning. A late one, perhaps, but real. Robert outlined the final terms: restitution of the identified funds, immediate suspension of all commercial use of the residence, transfer of all administrative passwords, revocation of all authorizations tied to Marshall's name, and the gradual phase-out of the Vance family from the private spaces of the estate. Beatrice turned pale. "Are you evicting us, Claire?" Claire answered with total serenity. "I am ending a confusion you people mistook for belonging." The matriarch narrowed her eyes. "After everything we did for you," Claire looked at her without an ounce of hatred. "You taught me exactly what I never want to become. That counts for something." It was during this meeting that Marshall asked to speak without a lawyer present. But this time he asked. He didn't command. Claire allowed him to continue speaking right there in front of Robert and Beatrice, because intimacy had already been used as a hiding place far too many times. He took a deep breath, hands clasped on the table. "I spent years telling myself that you made me feel small. It was easier to believe that than to admit I was terrified of being ordinary." Beatrice closed her eyes, deeply offended by this public honesty. Marshall continued, "When your father died, I should have protected your grief. Instead, I saw a chance to prove I could run what he left behind. I called it taking care of you, but it was pure vanity. And when you trusted me, I treated that trust like a license to act like the owner." Claire felt her throat tighten. Not because his words erased the wound, but because it was the first time he accurately described the emotional crime without demanding she downplay it. "Isabella didn't walk into this house on her own," he said. "I opened the door, I gave her the passcode. I let my mother treat you like a visitor because it made me look bigger, and I am ashamed." The word ashamed came out differently this time, not as resentment aimed at Claire, but as accountability. Beatrice stood up, unable to endure the scene. "I will not sit here and listen to my son beg on his knees." Marshall looked at his mother. "Maybe that is the problem. You always thought apologizing was begging on your knees. Sometimes, it's just getting up from the wrong chair." Beatrice had no response. Neither did Claire. There are phrases that arrive far too late to save a love, but just early enough to stop hatred from becoming an inheritance. When the meeting ended, Beatrice left the mansion without saying goodbye, carrying the rigidity of someone who preferred to lose territory rather than apologize. Marshall lingered in the indoor conservatory, staring at the shut-off fountain. Claire walked past him to grab her last box of personal items from the home office. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. She stopped, keeping a safe distance. 1 minute. He accepted the boundary like a man finally learning that limits are tough gifts. "I am not going to ask you to come back." Claire let out a breath, surprised by the rush of relief. "Thank you." He gave a joyless smile. "I wanted to ask. I spent nights rehearsing it, but I realized it would just be another way of thinking only about what I am losing." She looked at him and, for a split second, saw the man she had fallen in love with before the polish, before the estate, before the galas where they both started playing roles. "What are you going to do?" Marshall looked down at his hands. "Move out of the mansion, find a place in the city, settle what I owe the trust, and step away from the firm for a while if the partners demand it." Claire realized he was genuinely terrified. Not of her punishment, but of the void left when the pedestal is removed. "That doesn't fix everything, I know," he added. "And it doesn't buy back trust, I know that too." The silence between them felt less hostile. Marshall then pulled her wedding ring from his pocket, the one she had left on the bed, now wrapped in a handkerchief. "I don't want to give this back as a request. I just thought it should be with you. To do with it whatever you want." Claire took the ring and felt its small weight. For years it had represented permanence. Now it just felt like gold. "I will decide later." Marshall nodded. "You always should have had the power to decide." Claire made her decision about the mansion on a clear sky morning, when New York seemed less gray and Fifth Avenue reflected light off the skyscrapers, looking as if the city had been washed clean overnight. She walked through the Greenwich rooms accompanied by Robert, Martha, and an architect specializing in cultural spaces. She would not sell the house immediately. A large wing of the estate would be transformed into the Arthur Adams Foundation, dedicated to providing grants and scholarships for young women in business, law, and the arts. The very rooms that used to host picture-perfect dinners would now host seminars. The master bedroom would remain locked for a while, not as a mausoleum of pain, but as a space in transition. "Are you sure?" Robert asked, watching her stand before the door. Claire touched the doorknob. "My father built protection for me. Maybe now this house can protect other people too." Martha discreetly wiped her eyes. "He would love that." Claire smiled for the first time in that house without feeling like she was betraying her own sadness. "I think so too." Inside the closet, she removed the last of Marshall's belongings, which he had left neatly packed in boxes. There were no hidden notes, no flowers, no attempts at manipulation. Just absence. Curiously, that absence respected her more than many of his presences ever had. As she left the bedroom, Claire took one final look at the bed, the mirror, the armchair where the robe had sat. The place still ached, but it no longer ruled her. Months passed before Claire and Marshall met again without legal folders on a table. It was at a quiet coffee shop near Central Park, on an afternoon where the city blended rushing executives, students, tourists, and street artists. Claire agreed to see him because the legal divorce was proceeding without conflict, and because for the first time, she didn't feel like seeing him was a step backward. Marshall arrived looking simple. No driver, no flashy watch, carrying only a book. He looked less impressive and much more human. Perhaps that was what he had always feared. "Are you doing well?" he asked. Claire stirred her coffee. "Some days yes, some days not yet. But every day belongs to me." He absorbed the answer with respect. "I started therapy." She looked up, surprised but without irony. "That is good. I'm not telling you this to score points, I know." He placed the book on the table. It was the architecture volume where he had found her note. "I found another quote of yours. I thought I should return it." Claire opened it to the marked page. Her old handwriting read, "A house is only a home when no one has to shrink to fit inside it." She felt her chest tighten, but she didn't cry. Marshall said, "I read that so many times I memorized it." Claire closed the book carefully. "I hope one day you build a house where you can live that quote." He looked at her. "And there was love there, yes, but without demands. And you?" Claire smiled softly. "I am building a life where I don't need to wait for someone to give me a seat." The divorce was signed without an audience in a bright midtown conference room, with Robert on one side, Marshall's lawyer on the other, and a fine rain hitting the glass windows. Beatrice did not attend. Isabella never reached out again. Marshall signed first, his hand steady enough not to look like a victim. Claire signed next, using her full name, Claire Adams. Seeing her maiden name fully restored on paper, she didn't feel triumph, but alignment. Like an old gear sliding back into place, Marshall watched her, and instead of looking wounded, he seemed to accept it. "It suits you," he said. Claire looked at her signature. It always did. After the meeting, he walked her to the elevator. For a few seconds, they stood side by side, unsure if there were adequate goodbyes for marriages that die long before they actually end. "I loved you," he said quietly. Claire clutched her briefcase to her chest. "I loved you too. The difference is, now that doesn't obligate me to go back." Marshall nodded, his eyes glassy, but he didn't try to touch her. The elevator doors opened. Claire stepped in before they could close. He said, "Thank you for not destroying everything when you had the power to." She replied, "Do not confuse things. I destroyed the lie. The rest, everyone decides how to rebuild for themselves." The doors slid shut, and for the first time, the separation didn't feel like a fall. It felt like an exit. At the quiet inauguration of the Arthur Adams Foundation, the Greenwich estate received a different kind of crowd. There were no hidden mistresses, no mothers-in-law policing social standing, no businessmen using other people's walls as symbols of their own power. There were students, professors, lawyers, artists, young women clutching portfolios with the beautiful anxiety of someone stepping into a room they never imagined they'd be allowed in. Claire gave a speech without dramatizing her own story. She spoke of legacy as responsibility, of trust as a precious choice, of financial and emotional education, of houses that need to stop being display windows to become open doors. Martha sat in the front row, now calmly managing the estate's staff with serene pride. Robert watched from the back, satisfied. In a corner of the main hall, on a glass table, sat a small exhibit of Arthur's belongings: a pen, a photograph, letters, and a framed quote that Claire had personally chosen. "Love does not require blindness." No one there knew exactly what that sentence had cost. Perhaps they didn't need to. Near the end of the event, Claire walked up the stairs alone and opened the door to the former master bedroom. The space was empty. No bed, no mirrors, no clothes. The architects were going to transform the room into a reading lounge. Claire stood in the center for a few seconds, listening to the silence. It was no longer the silence of humiliation. It was space. It was the future. That night, after everyone had left, Claire returned to the Manhattan apartment instead of sleeping at the estate. She liked ending important days in the place where she had started over. On the table, she placed her wedding ring inside a small envelope addressed to a jeweler. It would be melted down into two simple pieces: a donation for the foundation's charity auction, and a thin gold bookmark engraved with the initials CAM. She didn't want to wear the past on her finger, but maybe she could transform it into something that held pages together instead of broken promises. The ivory robe remained packed away, clean, scentless, strange, without a purpose. Maybe one day she would donate it to the foundation's theater arts archive. Maybe she would never touch it again. Claire opened the window. The city gleamed restless, massive, imperfect, alive. She thought of Marshall, probably in some new apartment, staring at a kitchen that felt too small for his old ego. She thought of Isabella, somewhere out there, trying to understand that being chosen shouldn't require an invasion. She thought of Beatrice, sitting alone under the weight of an authority that could no longer bend anyone inside that house. And she thought of herself. Not as an abandoned wife, nor as a vindictive heiress, nor as a woman who defeated a mistress. Just Claire, the woman who walked down a staircase with a suitcase in her hand, looking to everyone else like she was walking away. Only she knew the whole truth that night. For the first time in years, she was actually walking back to herself. 3 months after the foundation opened, the Greenwich mansion no longer felt like the same house. The flowers were still white, the marble still shined, the chandeliers still cast light against the pale walls, but the silence had changed its nature. Before, it was the silence of hidden things, smothered betrayals, averted glances, and venomous phrases delivered with wine glasses in hand. Now, it was the silence of a newly opened library, of young women reading at wide tables, of respectful footsteps in the halls, of women walking through doors that once served only to separate those who gave orders from those who obeyed. Claire walked through the main foyer, unhurried, wearing a simple light blue dress, her hair down, no wedding ring, no visible armor. There were still days when the past tapped her on the shoulder, but it no longer dragged her backward. Martha managed the reception desk with a tranquil authority. She was no longer just the housekeeper. She was the guardian of the estate's memory. When a 19-year-old student, the daughter of a seamstress from Queens, stopped at the base of the stairs and asked if she was allowed to go up to the reading room, Martha smiled as if the question healed an old wound. "You can, my child. This house is meant for that now." Claire heard the exchange from afar and felt something bloom inside her. For years, that staircase had been the stage of her humiliation. Suitcase in hand, robe over her arm, a husband begging too late, a family judging her pain as an inconvenience. Now, that same staircase received the footsteps of girls carrying notebooks, dreams, and the fear of not belonging. Claire realized then that transforming a place did not mean erasing what happened there. It meant ensuring that pain was not the final resident. That afternoon, Marshall showed up unannounced, but he didn't try to walk in like an owner. He waited outside near the security gate, waiting for authorization from the reception desk. When Claire was notified, she felt her heart react with an old memory, but it was no longer a tremor of dependency. It was just memory. She walked down to the gardens where he stood, wearing a white shirt, dark trousers, no flashy watch, holding a small folder. Marshall looked less powerful and, because of that, infinitely more real. "I know I should have made an appointment," he said. "I didn't come to interrupt. I just wanted to drop this off." Claire looked at the folder. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. The confirmation of the final restitution transfer to the trust. And a letter. Not to change anything. Not to ask to come back. Just to put on the record what I didn't know how to say properly. Claire took the papers but did not open them. "Are you doing okay?" The question slipped out before she could calculate it. Marshall smiled sadly. "I am learning not to call emptiness an injustice. Some days are hard, but they are honest." They walked over to a garden bench, keeping the comfortable distance of two people who had loved each other, hurt each other, and finally stopped competing over who suffered more. Marshall looked up at the estate. "It looks different." Claire followed his gaze. "The house, or you?" He let out a low laugh. "Maybe both. I used to look at this facade and think about what it said about me. Now I look at it and see what I tried to steal from you without calling it a theft." Claire did not answer immediately. There was a time when this confession would have been everything she wanted to hear. Now, it was important, but not enough to rewrite history. "You didn't steal everything," she said. "You tried, but I also took too long to lock the door." Marshall lowered his head. "You still blame yourself." Claire looked at the windows of the former master suite, now the reading room. "Sometimes, but less and less. Trusting someone was not my mistake. My mistake was continuing to confuse clear red flags with rough patches." He nodded, accepting the sentence like someone receiving a fair verdict. Before leaving, Marshall asked to see the reading room. Claire hesitated, but allowed it. They walked up the stairs together in silence. Inside the old master bedroom, there was no bed, no closet, no oval mirror. There were bookshelves, armchairs, study desks, warm lamps, and a large window open to the garden. Right where Isabella had stood wearing the robe, a young girl was now reading a civil law textbook, her forehead wrinkled in concentration. Marshall stopped at the door, unable to walk right in. "I destroyed this room," he murmured. Claire stood next to him. "No. You just revealed what it had become." He looked at her. "And you made something else grow here." Claire gave a faint smile. "I didn't want this room to remain an altar to my shame." One of the students looked up, recognized Claire, and beamed. "Miss Adams, could you look at my essay draft later?" Claire answered, "Of course, I will come over." Marshall watched that simple exchange and understood that Claire had recovered something much larger than a house. She had recovered the right to be a beacon without needing to be anyone's wife. When Marshall left, he left his letter on a table, but Claire only opened it that night, alone in her Manhattan apartment. The letter wasn't long. He wrote that he had started to understand that asking for forgiveness wasn't a strategy to be accepted back, but a way to stop lying to himself. He wrote that he felt ashamed for using her love as a ladder for his own pride. He wrote that Isabella had also been hurt by a cowardly promise, even if that didn't absolve her of her choices. And he ended with a simple sentence. "You didn't take a house from me, Claire. You took a lie. I am still learning how to live without it." Claire folded the letter slowly. She didn't cry like she used to. She just tucked it into the back of a drawer. Not next to her father's letters, but not in the trash either. Some belated truths don't deserve to return to the heart, but they do deserve to exist. The following week, Claire ran into Isabella by chance at a small cafe in Soho. Isabella's first reaction was to flee, then to harden her face, then to pretend she didn't care. She looked different. Less gloss, less posing, a more muted elegance, and dark circles that no foundation could entirely hide. Claire could have walked right past her, but she stopped. Isabella, the other woman, lifted her chin. "If you came to see me defeated, you are late. I am still standing." Claire looked at her without contempt. "I know. That is why I stopped." Isabella looked confused. Claire continued. "I didn't come to forgive you. I didn't come to punish you either. I just want to say one thing. Never again accept being the proof of a man's power. Not to hurt another woman, and not to make yourself feel chosen. Isabella gripped her coffee cup tightly. You speak as if it's easy when you have a last name like yours. Claire took a deep breath. It is not easy for anyone to learn dignity when we are taught that love means being put on display. But you can still choose not to repeat this. Isabella looked down, and for a moment the arrogance faded. I thought if I walked into that house, my life would finally begin. Claire replied with gentle firmness. A life that begins by stealing someone else's place is born already owing an apology. The two women did not hug. They did not become friends. There was no beautiful reconciliation to wrap up the story as if all wounds were lessons tied with a bow. Isabella merely nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and Claire walked out of the cafe, feeling that the conversation hadn't erased anything, but it had finally oiled a door that had been creaking inside her. Out on the sidewalk, the New York sun bounced off storefront windows, cars stuck in gridlock, and people rushing by, entirely too busy to notice tiny, intimate revolutions. Claire walked unhurriedly toward her car. There was a text on her phone from Martha. The new scholarship girls have arrived. The house is full. Claire smiled. For a long time, she had been terrified of losing a house. Now, she understood that a house wasn't something someone promised to share while hiding betrayals. A house was the place where your voice never had to ask for permission to exist. That night, Claire returned to the foundation for a roundtable discussion with the grant recipients. One of them timidly asked how a woman knows when it is time to walk away. Claire fell silent for a few seconds. She didn't want to turn her pain into a recipe, because every story has its own labyrinths. So she answered with raw honesty. You know when you realize you are betraying yourself just so you don't lose someone else. You know when the peace of the house relies entirely on your silence. You know when they call your pain an overreaction and your dignity pride. Walking away doesn't mean you didn't love them. Sometimes it just means you finally started loving yourself, too. The room grew quiet. It wasn't the old silence of the mansion. It was a different one. A silence of recognition. Claire looked at those women and felt that the staircase, the bedroom, the robe, and the suitcase were no longer just symbols of a humiliation. They were the steps to an exit. And in that exit, many others could find their courage. This story is a drama of marriage, betrayal, family power dynamics, and female reconstruction. On the entertainment side, it grips the audience through the powerful visual of a wife opening her bedroom door to find a mistress wearing her robe, the contrast between luxury and humiliation, the tension within a wealthy elite family, and the dramatic satisfaction of watching a silent woman reclaim her dignity without screaming, begging, or lowering herself. But on the educational side, the story touches on something much deeper. No one should confuse love with submission, marriage with ownership, silence with weakness, or financial assets with emotional power. Claire does not win because she is rich. She wins because she finally understands that trusting someone does not mean surrendering her identity, her home, her history, and her voice. The mansion represents more than money. It represents the intimate space of a woman that was physically, emotionally, and symbolically invaded. The narrative also teaches that betrayal rarely starts in the bedroom. Often, it begins much earlier, when a partner belittles the other, when a family treats a daughter-in-law like an ornament, when a woman is forced to swallow disrespect to preserve appearances, and when a man uses her love as a stepping stone to feed his own ego. Marshall does not fall solely because he cheated. He falls because he built his life upon a lie, pretending to own everything while entirely dependent on his wife's trust. Another educational point is showing that true female strength doesn't always arrive in the form of a screaming match. Claire does not hit, yell, or fight over her husband as if he were a prize. She makes decisions, seeks legal counsel, secures evidence, establishes boundaries, and transforms a house of pain into a foundation for other women. This illustrates a mature form of justice. It is not empty revenge. It is the reorganization of the truth. The character of Isabella also brings a crucial reflection. She is not innocent, but her presence highlights how some people confuse being chosen with taking another woman's place. The story warns that seeking validation by tearing down another woman does not cure insecurity. It only creates new wounds. Being seen, loved, and respected should never require erasing someone else. For the audience, this story is educational because it tackles self-worth, boundaries, emotional abuse disguised as family etiquette, financial manipulation, emotional dependency, and the courage to start over. And it is highly entertaining because it weaves all these themes into a narrative packed with tension, luxury, revelations, sharp dialogue, and visually striking scenes like a true modern premium drama. A woman does not lose her value when she walks out of a house where she was humiliated. Often, it is exactly by walking out that she reclaims everything they tried to take from her: her voice, her name, her dignity, and her absolute right to belong to herself.